beneath a sky that swallowed the sun in shades of grey. A medal, gleaming despite its years, was torn from its place of honor and hurled with contempt to the floor. The act, fueled by rage, came from Ethan, a 17-year-old whose hands shook as the metal landed among forgotten debris. The sound, a sharp clank, echoed through the modest room, where time-worn walls seemed to hold their breath. Henry, his grandfather, 82 years old with eyes harboring decades of secrets, stood still, his chest gripped by an unnamed pain. What drives someone to spit on the past of a man who sacrificed everything? Ethan, his face burning with fury, saw his grandfather not as a hero but as a burden, an old man clinging to tales of a time the youth deemed irrelevant. The scars on Henry's body, the silences that weighed on sleepless nights, the cries that pierced the dark. None of it mattered to Ethan. He slammed doors, rolled his eyes, rejected every attempt by his grandfather to share what the war had cost him. But what if this anger was merely a veil, concealing something Ethan wasn't yet ready to face? The medal, now among trash and neglect, seemed to pulse with a force that defied the boy's gesture. It wasn't just an object, but a testament to a man who had crossed through hell and returned, bearing choices Ethan, immersed in screens and instant answers, had never needed to make. The young man's fury, however fierce, couldn't erase what that metal symbolized. What if deep down, Ethan knew he'd discarded more than an object? What if that impulsive act was the first step toward a truth he wasn't prepared to confront, the key? Silence that followed was heavy, as if the entire house held its breath. Henry, with his stooped posture but steady eyes, said nothing, yet his gaze seemed to pierce through Ethan, seeing beyond the anger, beyond the boy he still was. Ethan, meanwhile, felt a void growing in his chest, a restlessness his rage couldn't explain. Something stirred, an invisible current pulling them toward a greater fate. What could extinguish the flames of anger and make room for respect? What could transform an act of hatred into a moment of redemption? As night consumed the last traces of light, the story of Henry and Ethan was only beginning to unfold. A revelation loomed, slow, like a storm, gathering in silence before it breaks. Every detail is a piece of a puzzle that will only make sense in the end. What do you think will change everything between this grandfather and his grandson? Stay until the end, for what comes next is more profound than either could imagine. The room, steeped in the scent of aged wood and stale coffee, seemed to shrink that night, as if the walls bowed under the weight of Ethan's act. The 17-year-old still felt the heat of anger throbbing in his temples, but the emptiness that followed was more oppressive. He slumped onto the couch, earphones dangling around his neck like a chain, while the echo of metal hitting the trash lingered in his mind. Henry, his 82-year-old grandfather, stayed in his usual chair, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the window, where darkness devoured the backyard. The silence between them wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a barrier, built from years of untold stories and ignored truths. Ethan, with his sharp-edged youth, believed his grandfather was merely a relic of an outdated era, an old man trapped in memories that had no place in a world of screens and haste. But something in that silence tugged at the boy's soul, like a nameless shadow. Henry, a man of few words, carried in every wrinkle a story Ethan had never bothered to unravel. In his youth, he had crossed fields where death whispered with every step, where fear was a constant companion. The medal, now desecrated, wasn't a trophy, but a reminder of sleepless nights, of names that still haunted his dreams. Ethan's anger was a cry from something he himself didn't understand. The house, with its weathered walls, seemed to watch, as if it knew the boy's act was merely the start of something larger. As the night deepened, Ethan rose, restless, his chest tight with an unnameable feeling. He passed the kitchen, where the trash still held the metal, and paused. For a moment, his fingers trembled, as if yearning to reclaim what he'd cast aside. But anger, though weakened, still flickered, and he turned away. Henry, in another corner of the house, picked up a worn hardcover notebook, his shaky hands flipping through yellowed pages. There lay the letters never sent, the words never spoken, the memories Ethan mocked without knowing. What could make a young man grasp the weight of a past he never lived? The house, with its objects that held stories, seemed to conspire, as if every corner whispered Henry's presence. The next morning brought a faint restraint, barely piercing the threadbare curtains. Ethan, with dark circles betraying a restless night, avoided his grandfather, but the house seemed to thwart his escape. Every detail, the faded photo on the shelf, the clock frozen years ago, seemed to shout Henry's name. The veteran, moving with deliberate slowness, didn't confront his grandson. Instead, he left the notebook open on the table, a silent lure. Ethan's anger, once a blaze that consumed everything, began to yield to a deeper unease. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but throwing the medal away now felt bigger than him. It was as if he'd opened a door he couldn't close. Henry, with the patience of one who'd faced worse storms, continued his routine. But his eyes followed his grandson, not with anger, but with a hope Ethan couldn't see. The medal, still among the debris, was more than a lost object. It was a symbol of a bridge yet to be built. That day, something shifted, subtle as the breeze before rain. Ethan, without knowing why, picked up his grandfather's notebook. His hands, used to keyboards and screens, felt the weight of the pages, the scent of aged paper. He didn't read, not yet, but merely holding the notebook made his chest tighten. Henry, from the porch, watched his grandson with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The house, with its walls that held secrets, seemed to exhale in relief. The path was set, and every step Ethan took, even unknowingly, brought him closer to a transformative truth. At night, hidden in his room, Ethan opened the notebook's first page. Henry's words hit him like a blow. They weren't tales of glory, but confessions of fear, loss, nights when the grandfather, then a 20-year-old, thought he'd never see dawn. Ethan, at 17, felt the ground shift beneath him. For the first time, Henry wasn't just an old man shouting too loudly, but a person who'd been young, who'd trembled, who'd survived. The anger that once blinded him now seemed frail against those lines. How can someone dismiss what they've never tried to understand? The medal, still in the trash, seemed to beckon, as if it knew its story wasn't over. Henry in the living room felt the weight of years, but also an unexplainable lightness. He knew Ethan had touched the notebook, knew the words were doing their work. The veteran needed no confrontations or grand gestures. He understood the power of time, of truth revealed slowly. Ethan, meanwhile, read with a racing heart, each line a mirror reflecting his own insecurities. He didn't understand everything yet, but something within him began to give way. The following days were a quiet battle. Ethan, with the notebook now hidden under his pillow, returned to its pages whenever the house fell silent. Henry's words weren't just stories. They were a map of a soul Ethan was starting to recognize. The young man, who once saw his grandfather as a burden, now glimpsed fragments of a person who'd been like him, full of doubts, fears, and dreams. Henry, meanwhile, kept his routine, but his eyes shone with a certainty only years can bring. He knew his grandson was changing, even if Ethan still fought it. The tension in the house was no longer of anger but of anticipation. Ethan, with his restless youth, began to ask questions, not aloud, but in silence, as he read. Why did Henry never speak of his pain? Why keep it all in that notebook? The answers, he found, lay not just in the words, but in his grandfather's. Silences in the glances he cast when he thought no one saw. Henry, with his battle-forged patience, waited, knowing his grandson needed to find the path alone. The house, with its story-laden objects, seemed to conspire, guiding Ethan toward an inescapable truth. The medal, forgotten in the trash, seemed to wait, as if it knew its time to return was coming. Ethan, with his nights now filled by his grandfather's words, felt his anger fade, replaced by a curiosity he couldn't ignore. He began to see Henry not as a stranger, but as a reflection of himself, someone who, despite the gap of years, had faced his own inner battles. Henry, in turn, moved with a calm that belied his 82 years, as if he knew time was on his side. The house, with its walls that had witnessed so much pain, seemed to hum with new energy. Ethan, still grappling with the pride of youth, felt the notebook's weight as something alive, calling him to be more than he was. Henry, with his quiet wisdom, didn't push his grandson to speak, but left clues, a glance, a gesture, the photo on the shelf that now seemed sharper. What could make a young man see his grandfather as a mirror of his own struggles? One afternoon, as the sun bathed the backyard in golden hues, Ethan stood before the trash, the notebook still burned in his hands, Henry's words echoing like a summons. He hesitated, heart pounding, then reached into the debris, his fingers trembling as they grazed the cold metal of the medal. It wasn't just an object. It was the weight of a life he was beginning to understand. Henry, from the porch, saw the act but said nothing. His eyes, however, gleamed with something no longer hope, but certainty. Ethan, holding the medal, felt the ground steady beneath him for the first time in days. His anger had dissolved, giving way to something new, something he couldn't yet name. The house, with its memory-laden walls, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Henry, at 82, watched from afar, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The notebook had done its work, but the journey was far from over. Every word read, every silence shared, was a brick in the bridge being built between them. The medal, now reclaimed, wasn't an end, but a new beginning. Ethan, at 17, held the medal as if for the first time, seeing it not as a trophy, but as a piece of his grandfather. Henry, with a posture that defied his years, approached, not with words, but with a gentle touch on his grandson's shoulder. In that gesture, there was more than affection. There was forgiveness, understanding, continuity. The house, with its story-filled objects, seemed to pulse with renewed energy. What could turn an act of rage into a moment of redemption? The answer lay there, in the house, the notebook, the glances that finally met. Ethan, his heart still racing, felt something that made him want to be better, not just for Henry, but for himself. Henry, with his silent wisdom, knew his grandson would carry his stories, not as a burden, but as a compass. The evening light bathed the room, no longer stifling but welcoming, as if the house, with its worn walls, had finally exhaled a sigh of relief. Ethan, at 17, held the reclaimed medal, his fingers tracing its edges as if he could read Henry's scars etched in the metal. His grandfather, 82, stood beside him, not in his usual chair, but upright, with a stance that seemed to defy time. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there were no walls, only a bridge, fragile but firm, built from understood silences and shared truths. The notebook, now closed on the table, was no longer a secret, but a living testament. The medal, once thrown in anger, rested in Ethan's hands like a beacon, illuminating not just Henry's past, but the future they could share. Every story his grandfather had told, every handwritten line, had become a mirror where Ethan saw not only the veteran but himself, his doubts, fears, and search for meaning. Henry, with his patience carved in battles, needed no words to confirm. What he felt, his grandson, once blinded by rage, now saw. The house, with its memory-laden objects, seemed to pulse with fresh energy. Ethan placed the medal on the shelf, beside the black-and-white photo he'd once ignored. The act, simple yet profound, was a silent vow. He wouldn't discard his grandfather's legacy again. Henry, with a faint smile bearing the weight of 82 years, touched his grandson's shoulder, and in that touch, There was more than affection. There was a connection that transcended time. The anger that had once divided them was now mere ashes, scattered by the wind of a truth they both embraced. The room, bathed in soft light, seemed larger, as if the walls had parted to let in the air of a new beginning. Ethan, his heart still racing, felt something that urged him to be better, not just for Henry, but for himself. Henry, with his quiet wisdom, knew his grandson would carry his stories as a guiding light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues that whispered promises, Ethan and Henry lingered in the room, now a space of reconciliation. The medal, back on its shelf, glowed in the evening light, no longer just an object but a symbol of a bridge built across generations. Ethan, at 17, felt the notebook and medal as parts of himself, as if Henry's stories had woven into his own aspirations. Henry, at 82, looked at his grandson with a serenity only time can grant. The house, with its walls that had witnessed pain and hope, seemed to hum with renewed vigor. Every object, the faded photo, the broken clock, the now closed notebook, told a story Ethan finally wanted to hear. He was no longer the boy who slammed doors, but someone who grasped the value of listening, connecting, carrying forward what mattered. Henry, in turn, felt a lightness he hadn't known in years, as if the weight of his memories had found a new home in his grandson's heart. The journey of Ethan and Henry wasn't just about a reclaimed medal or a read notebook. It was about what happens when pride yields and the heart finally listens. Every shared silence, every exchanged glance, was a brick in the bridge now uniting them. The anger, once seemingly insurmountable, had transformed into respect, understanding, something. Neither could name, but both felt. What endures when all else fades? The truth that no one is an island, but part of an archipelago of intertwined souls. Ethan, with his restless youth, now saw his grandfather as a reflection of himself, someone who'd faced his own battles and emerged stronger. Henry, with his time-honed patience, knew his grandson would carry his stories forward, not as a burden, but as a light. Beneath a sky surrendering to night, the story of Henry and Ethan didn't end, but transformed into an invitation. The medal, restored to its place, shone like a lighthouse, reminding them that the past isn't a burden, but an anchor giving meaning to the present. Ethan, at 17, felt the notebook and medal as extensions of himself, as if Henry's stories had merged with his own dreams. Henry, at 82, looked at his grandson with silent certainty. The legacy he'd carried for decades now had a new keeper. The house, with its walls that held memories, seemed finally at peace, as if it had fulfilled its role as witness and guide. Every object, every corner, told a story Ethan now cherished. He was no longer the youth who threw the past away, but someone who understood the value of listening, connecting, carrying forward what matters. Henry, with his battle-forged wisdom, knew his grandson had not only inherited his stories, but would transform them into something new. And so, the journey of Ethan and Henry reminds us that we all carry invisible medals, unread notebooks, silences begging to be heard. Don't let anger dim what deserves to shine. Each of us is part of a larger story, woven by those who came before and those who will follow. True courage lies not in facing the world, but in recognizing the worth of those beside us. Tap the screen, leave a like, share this story, comment on what stirred your heart. Subscribe, because this journey isn't just theirs, it's yours. The next story might be the one that changes everything. After all, what is a life if not the moment we choose to hear what the heart has always known?